Good evening and welcome to the very last episode of What the Friday for 2022. And it seems like this year has just flown by, right? Well, it's like 1 minute we were waiting to count down the ball drop in Times Square, and here we are getting ready to do it again. All right, so moving on to tonight's episode. Now, I can't recall ever talking about anything that has happened in the state of Alaska, and maybe it's a good thing. It seems like they're pretty safe. But tonight's gonna change that because I'm bringing you the story of serial killer Robert Hansen, also known as Bob the Baker by his neighbors, and the Butcher Baker because of his crimes.
Welcome to What the Friday, the After Dark series presented by Mystery, Murder, and Magic. Listener discretion is advised.
I mentioned Alaska, but tonight's story actually starts in Iowa because that's where Robert Christian Bose Hansen was born on February 15, 1939. He was the oldest of two children, and in 1942, the family of four moved out to Richmond, California. For whatever reason, though, Robert didn't stay there very long and he moved back to Iowa, but this time settling in Pocahontas, and that was in 1949. Growing up, Robert was very shy. He had really bad acne, which left scars, and he had a stutter. Maybe because of those two reasons, he wasn't very popular with the girls, so he soon hated them and he started having fantasies of inflicting cruel revenge on them. And on top of that, he was forced to work long hours in the family bakery, and he was born left-handed, but his parents forced him to use his right hand. It's believed that because of that, him being forced to use his right hand, that he developed that stutter. And he also developed a love for hunting and archery, so this was something that he found to bring him peace and comfort. Around the time he turned 18, he enlisted in the U.S. Army Reserves, but he only served 1 year before he was discharged. And after that, he worked as an assistant drill instructor at a police academy, and while he was working there, he met and fell in love with a young lady. And the two married in the summer of 1960. That marriage didn't last very long, though. As far as we know, Robert committed his first crime around December 7, 1960. And apparently he wanted revenge on his high school for how he was treated while he was in high school. So he burned down the school bus garage at the Pocahontas County Board of Education. He was sentenced to 3 years at Anamosa State Penitentiary, but he served only 20 months of that sentence. During that time, his wife divorced him. But while he was in there in that prison, he was diagnosed with manic depression with periodic schizophrenic episodes. The psychiatrist who gave him this diagnosis noted that Robert had an infantile personality and a strong need for revenge on those who felt that had done him wrong, so he felt the need to get revenge. Well, after he was released from prison, he did jail time for several petty theft charges. In 1963, he and his second wife and their two kids, they moved to Anchorage, Alaska. Sorry, Ariel distracted me. But anyway, they moved to Anchorage, Alaska. And sometime after they moved there, he opened a small bakery, and his neighbors there liked him, and he even set a few hunting records there. So it sounds like things were improving for Robert, right? Wrong. Very, very wrong. Because in December 1971, he was arrested not once, but twice. The first time he was arrested for kidnapping and attempting to rape a woman. And the second time he was arrested for sexually assaulting a sex worker. With the first arrest, he pleaded no contest to assault with a deadly weapon. And with the arrest involving the sex worker, the charge was dropped because he went with a plea bargain. And he was sentenced to 5 years, but after 6 months, he was placed in a work release program and sent to a halfway house. Less than 5 years later, he was in trouble with the law again. This time he got caught stealing a chainsaw from a Fred Meyer store in Anchorage, and he was sentenced to 5 years, but this time it was required that he receive psychiatric care for his bipolar disorder. However, that sentence was sent to the Alaska Supreme Court, and they overturned his sentence, and he basically got away with just time served. From there, he moved on to bigger crimes, and when I say bigger, I'm talking murder. His career as a serial killer is believed to have began around 1972, and the way that he carried out at least some of these murders is truly sickening. So what he would do is go cruising for prostitutes and sometimes exotic dancers, and once he got them in his car, he would drive them to his house and then force them at gunpoint into the house. After he had raped them, they would then fly out to a remote area and then hunt them like an animal before either shooting or stabbing them. Sometimes that hunt, it would last for just hours, but other times it would go on for days. Celia Beth Van Zanten is believed to have been his first victim. She was kidnapped on December 22nd, 1971, and after she was released into the wilderness, she ended up freezing to death, and her body was found on Christmas Day. Now, just 3 days before Van Zanten was kidnapped, he had assaulted another prostitute. And there's been some talk that he may not have been involved in Van Zanten's death, even though the modus operandi was similar to other murders, and Robert himself claims that he had nothing to do with it. On July the 7th, 1973, Megan Emmerich went missing from the boarding school that she attended. She was last seen leaving her dorm after doing her laundry, and when she left all of her belongings behind, and she was never heard from again. Now, even though Robert says that he was in the area at that time, he denies having anything to do with her disappearance. Megan was only 17 years old, the same age that Van Zanten had been at the time of her death. Nearly 2 years to the day later, Mary Kathleen Thiel disappeared. Mary lived on Lower Point Road in Seward, Alaska, with her husband, but her husband was away at that time at work on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. She was last seen when a friend of hers gave her a ride into town and dropped her off at the bakery. On that same day, another friend saw Mary at the waterfall on Lowell Point Road between the times of 1:30 and 2 p.m. That is the last time that anyone saw her. And again, Robert admitted that he was in that area on that day, but he had nothing to do with her disappearance either. Now, over the years, he would kill more women in the same fashion, but his crimes came to a screeching halt when on June 13th, 1983, he offered Cindy Paulson $200 for oral sex. She agreed to it and then got in the car with him. And as soon as she had gotten into the car with him, he pulled a gun on her and then drove her to his home in Muldoon. Once there, he held her hostage and repeatedly raped and tortured her. And when he was finished, he chained her to a pole in his basement. After he took a little nap, he put her back in his car and told her that he was driving her to his cabin, which was located in an area only accessible by plane or boat. And when they get to the airport, Cindy saw her chance to escape while Robert was loading stuff into the cockpit of his plane. While he had his back turned, Cindy crawled out of the back seat of his car and ran towards 6th Avenue. Robert realized what had happened, so he started chasing her, but he fortunately didn't catch up to her because when she reached 6th Avenue, she flagged down a truck. That truck driver drove her to the Mush Inn where she ran inside, and from there she asked the desk clerk to call her boyfriend. That truck driver continued on to work, and once he was there, he called the police and told them about the girl he had just picked up and dropped off. Anchorage police drove out to the Mush Inn where Cindy had been let out, and the clerk there told them that Cindy had taken a taxi to the Big Timber Motel, and that is where the police found her, still handcuffed. At that point, they drove her to headquarters. When the police talked to Cindy, she told them that she had left her blue tennis shoes on the passenger side floor in the back seat, and she had left them there to provide evidence that she had been in Robert's car. She also gave a description of Robert, and he was soon located. Well, of course, he denied what Cindy had told them and said that Cindy was just trying to cause problems for him because he had refused when she supposedly had tried to extort money from him. And on top of that, a friend of Robert's provided an alibi, so the police didn't consider him as being a suspect. Meanwhile, an investigation started because dead bodies were starting to be found in and around the Anchorage, Alaska area. The first of those bodies was found by construction workers near Eklutna Road, and that victim was dubbed Eklutna Annie because they hadn't been able to identify her, and to this day she is still unidentified. Later that same year, the body of another victim named Joanna Messina was found in a gravel pit outside of Seward. The body of 23-year-old Sherry Morrow was found the following year, and authorities believe that all three of these women had been murdered by the same person. At that point, the FBI was contacted for help in developing a suspect profile. The FBI profiler, John Douglas, believed that whoever was responsible for these homicides was an experienced hunter, and they would be someone with very low self-esteem. This person would have a history of being rejected by females, probably would collect little trinkets that had belonged to the victims, and he even went so far as to say that the person would have a stutter. Well, we all know who that sounds like, right? But investigators had to do a little digging, and that's when they came across Robert Hansen again. Robert fit that profile, and he owned an airplane. All of that, along with Cindy Paulson's testimony, gave them cause to obtain a search warrant for Robert's home, vehicles, and airplane. When they conducted the search on October 27, 1983, they discovered jewelry that had belonged to some of the missing women, a good-sized stash of firearms in his attic, and behind the headboard of Robert's bed, they found an aviation map. That aviation map was covered with 37 little X marks, and a lot of these X marks matched up to locations where bodies had been previously found. And investigators used the map to locate even more victims' bodies. So the investigators confronted Robert with what they had found, and I know you won't believe this, and that's sarcasm if you can't tell, but he denied knowing anything about it, and he kept denying it for as long as he could. And when he couldn't deny it any longer, he started putting the blame on the victims to account for what he had done. And can we say narcissist? But eventually, he caved and started confessing as each piece of evidence was shown to him. Once he was placed under arrest, he was charged with assault, kidnapping, multiple weapons offenses, and insurance fraud. Apparently, Robert filed a claim with an insurance company over the supposed theft of some trophies. And with the money he had gotten from that, he bought his airplane. And it just makes me wonder how much those trophies were worth. And I'm thinking it must have been like his trophies from the hunting competitions or whatever that he had won. Now, when he went to trial, though, he said that he had later found those trophies in his backyard, and it slipped his mind to let the insurance company know. Well, when ballistic tests proved that the bullets from the crime scene matched his rifle, he agreed to a plea bargain. Investigators had positive evidence for only 4 of the murders, so he pleaded guilty to those, and he gave details pertaining to his other victims in exchange for serving his sentence in a federal prison, as well as an agreement for no publicity from the media. He also had to help in figuring out, by the marks that they had found on that aviation map, to locate the other victims' bodies. Robert also told the police that their theory of how he got his victims was correct, and went on to say that sometimes he would let his victims go if they promised not to tell the police about what he had done to them. During the search for the bodies of other victims, Robert showed police 17 grave sites around the south central Alaska area, and 12 of those had been unknown to police. The bodies of 12 victims were located and returned to their families, and there were more, but Robert refused to help with those. Those were from marks on the map in Resurrection Bay, which is near Seward, and it's believed that among those marks was the gravesite of Mary Thiel and Megan Emmerich, but Robert wouldn't help with that, and he still denied killing them. Robert was sentenced to 461 years plus life in prison without the possibility of parole. And he was first imprisoned at the federal pen in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, but later he was moved to Lemon Creek Correctional in Juneau, and later in Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, until May of 2014, when he was moved because of his health, and he was moved to Anchorage Correctional Complex. He died on August 21st, 2014, at the age of 75 years old at Alaska Regional Hospital in Anchorage. And his cause of death, it was listed as natural causes due to some lingering health problems. The very idea of hunting humans like wild game is just disturbing, to say the least. But it's fascinated people, at least since the 1924 story. Is a short story by Richard Connell, and it was called The Most Dangerous Game. And it tells the story of a rich Russian nobleman who had gotten bored with trapping animals. So he lures this big game hunter to his island and then hunts them down for fun. There's also been novels, TV shows, and movies about this very subject. But even though some are fascinated with that, very few would even so much as entertain the idea of actually doing it. And at the beginning of tonight's episode, I mentioned that Robert was very well liked by his neighbors. They thought he was this mild-mannered man and was so wholesome. So imagine their surprise when they learned that what he had been up to for all those years. And I'm sure they were thinking that the police had the wrong man. And it would be easy to think that because we never really know what's going on in a person's head, or their home for that matter. Well, unfortunately, 5 of his victims were never found. But one thing that is interesting is that in October of 2021, the body of Robin Pelkey was finally identified using forensic genealogy. And if you listened on Monday night, I believe that was not this past Monday night, but about a week ago, I'm going to say, we talked about a lab called Parabon Nano Labs. And what they do is genealogy type DNA tracking. But anyway, so these authorities use that same lab. And anyway, for 37 years, they didn't have a positive ID on her body. And she was known as Horseshoe Harriet. But after she was identified, the Alaska Bureau of Investigations, finally had an ID on her so her family could lay her to rest finally and know what happened to their loved one. And after that, they've started working on the identity of Eucletna Annie that I mentioned earlier. But so far, I haven't been able to find if she's been identified yet. So I believe she hasn't, because I'm sure it would be news if she had. Well, y'all, that's all I have for tonight's episode of What the Friday. And if you're going to go out and celebrate New Year's Eve tomorrow night, please be careful out there. And it's also my birthday on New Year's Eve, but I'm planning on staying in and avoiding extra people. Y'all have a good night.